Mr. Gerard, I was wondering if you could comment on the White House's latest comments on idle oil and gas leases. This is the assertion that the oil and gas industry has let a lot of leased public lands go developed.
Well, I haven't seen exactly what they're going to say, but I understand today they will make an announcement suggesting that the industry is sitting on vast leases on the public lands and failing to produce them. And our response to that is that statement is oversimplified and it's misleading. And what I mean by that is if you look at their characterization of idle leases, normally they include in that leases where we're trying to get permits, we're trying to get permission to develop this land. For example, there was a permit approved just last week in Utah that Secretary Salazar took great credit for. We'd been waiting for 4.5 years for that approval. In the administration's previous analysis, they would have concluded that was an idle lease while we're waiting for Uncle Sam to give us permission to produce these resources, to identify the resource on public land. So the bottom line is it's election year politics in our view. It's unfortunate they keep going back to that red herring, but I suspect because of the pressure they're feeling now, because frankly they're inconsistent with where the American people are on the energy equation, that they'll continue to raise these issues. So again, it's very misleading. The industry last year alone invested $200 billion in the United States. So we're hardly sitting on anything. We're anxious to develop it, as Senator Dorgan mentioned earlier, in North Dakota as well.
So for Senator Dorgan, there's a question here. Earlier this morning, the White House's one of the top advisors on energy policy to President Obama, Heather Zeichel, said that the president is focused on increasing domestic oil and gas production, but in places where it makes sense. Do you see the administration opening new opportunities for oil development in a second Obama term?
I believe so. I mean, what happened with the BP spill in the Gulf changed things in the Gulf for a while, and understandably so. I mean, it wouldn't have made much sense to say this doesn't matter. Let's act as if this didn't happen. But I do think in the period ahead, we will see opening of new opportunities in federal lands. I think particularly the Eastern Gulf has significant opportunities. We opened a portion of it, I think in the 2007, I think it was the 2007 bill, we opened a portion. But there's a substantial amount of additional opportunity there and elsewhere. And I think any administration beginning next January is going to take steps to provide additional opportunities on federal lands.
Kevin Bock, a question for you. Do you believe speculation is having an effect on prices, oil prices?
I love that question, particularly given that Senator Dorgan asked me that question once, and it was a very sweaty response I gave. Yes, Senator, I do, but it's not the main effect was my answer then. And yes, questioner, I do, but it is not the main effect. Oil travels on the open sea. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to arrive physically in place. When it does, price is correct. Now, speculation can affect some markets that are less liquid and smaller. The U.S. natural gas market has been proven to be one where enforcement actions by the CFTC have been timely, and they have found that manipulation has occurred. The global oil price is set in 3 fundamental places with dozens of derivative places beyond it. It's only about 40% exchange traded, and it tends to reflect fundamentals no matter what you want it to do. So, but to the questioner, I would say, if speculators were manipulating oil prices, why aren't they better at it? Because it seems like they're not very good at their jobs.
Senator Dorgan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I have a career full of statements that I couldn't disavow if I wanted to. I think speculation plays a much more significant role than some do. I mean, I think the commodity index funds have changed the game over recent years. I think from the numbers that I have seen and studied suggest that rather than 30% of those in the market being speculators, it's now about 70%. And you know, you need to make a market. I understand, you know, when we wrote the legislation back in the Congress in the 1930s, we actually put a provision in dealing with excess speculation, because while you need to have a marketplace to establish pricing, You want that marketplace really to be inhabited to the larger extent by people who have oil to sell and those who want to purchase it. And now we have, as I quoted Will Rogers, who used to say in the past, he talked about people who will buy things that they'll never get from people that never had it, and through all that activity make money and establish pricing. But I think this is a very important question, and we need speculators. You need some speculation for liquidity in a marketplace. My own view is that marketplace is rife with excess speculation.
I would say that the Senator's made some very thoughtful comments on this in his career, and I'd applaud his thoughtfulness on the issue, because one thing about the Obama administration's proposal, whereas I think it may be premature to write the prescription before you've even diagnosed a disease, so things like new margin requirements, for example, and new position limits may be premature, I do think studying the problem makes sense. There's one particularly obscure area of the overall question that academic researchers really can't get to because the CFTC has most, if not all, of the answers. And more study will deliver more answers. One thing that we know is bad is price volatility is bad. And one way to get rid of price volatility is to give signals to companies like the oil companies that Jack represents that there's going to be demand and there's going to be a market out in the future. So as the price deck deepens, it may not be a risk as long as it doesn't steepen and pitch and fall a lot along the way, because that actually might help to guarantee that we will have supply. But I think the more we learn about it, the more it's going to look less like a smoking gun and more like a few people who may be bad apples in an otherwise very good market and a very good system.
Steve, 2 quick points I just add on it. Markets are driven by expectations. We see a great lesson in this country in the past year on the energy price. Compare crude oil with natural gas, right? A lot of conversation around the world. What are the factors that contribute to the global price of crude oil? Unrest in the Middle East, demand in emerging nations, the list goes on. The one piece we have control over here is adding to that marginal supply equation. So again, we would encourage the policymakers to step forward and say, you're never going to resolve the Middle East equation. You could if we brought more product into the market to relieve that tension. But now contrast that with the price of natural gas. That market too is driven by expectation. And there's a lot of people that would suggest there are other speculators, as they call them, that keep the price of natural gas low. But it's a market that's driven by what the expectation is. We've demonstrated bringing ample supply to the marketplace in the United States has brought that price down to $2.50 versus 13 or 14 of just 2 or 3 years ago. So we need to be thoughtful about the market and be mindful of where government plays an appropriate role and doesn't intervene too much and then unintentionally creates the volatility that nobody wants. We need certainty, long-term vision, let the markets play out, but contribute in those areas that will have broader supply-demand impact on it.
Joe Stanko, a question for you, although I think it could easily be posed to all of the panelists. Should Congress pass legislation to eliminate all energy subsidies and tax preferences, and then it says, or pass the administration's plans to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and use that revenue for renewable energy and new technologies?
Wow, is that an either-or question?
It's an or.
I think I would agree with folks who have said that energy policy should not pick winners and losers. And what I would like to see Congress do is to just try and remove barriers. I think there is a role for R&D. Unquestionably, there is good research and thoughtful research that could be funded. I think at some point the training wheels have to come off, though, on certain technologies. But I think much more could be accomplished by trying to even out a playing field, and particularly with regard to the permitting and the future regulation of sources, give industry some certainty that these decisions are going to be made reasonably using appropriate facts, and the implementation of them will be in a way that can enhance private capital investment.
But just to play devil's advocate, I mean, how is the administration supposed to respond to climate change given some of the policy constraints that we've talked about here today? What I mean by that is, they tried to pass cap and trade. That obviously failed because of opposition to it. They have tried to deal with the issue through regulation under the Clean Air Act, the EPA. Many groups, including API, oppose that. They're trying to deal with the issue by giving subsidies to alternative energy. That's become controversial in the case of companies that have failed, like Solyndra. So how then are they supposed to tackle the issue of climate change when all of these options are politically, for one reason or another, not viable?
Well, I think
how do you create that?
They're politically not viable because they haven't been able to convince a working majority in Congress to pass legislation. My own view is that the Clean Air Act is a square peg in a round hole to try and deal with climate issues. One thing, even though the administration's position is, given the Supreme Court ruling and the structure of the Clean Air Act, there are various things that have to happen with regard to greenhouse gases. I do think in the power plant NSPS is an example that you're not using the inherent flexibility that exists in the Act when you're doing things like looking at carbon capture and sequestration and deeming that an established commercial technology. So I think while they may be in a box because of the Supreme Court on climate change, that with regard to implementation in certain judgments, there could be a much better path forward. There are other things with regard
and what would that look like? What would be the right path? What would be the policies that you think maybe even your clients might support?
Well, I think it's not looking at technologies that are not ready for prime time and declaring them so. And that with regard, again, to issues with greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, they are, again, I think that's a square peg in a round hole. And we're just going to have more problems trying to deal with issues, and one of them that we're going to see, I think, a ruling on from a court is the tailoring rule, where there are actual numeric trigger numbers for permitting in the Clean Air Act, and EPA has said that we're not going to use those. We're going to have a different number for carbon and continue that, far off into the future.
Yeah. Last question for Mr. Connaughton. Considering that this is an election year, is there any potential for any compromise on energy to prevail in Congress, or does the campaign season undermine that?
Well, I'm the Pollyanna. I never say never. The 2007 energy bill was dead a month before it was huge bipartisan support just a month later. I've been involved in at least 5 pieces of legislation that were similarly dead in election cycles and not. So I never say never, because things can change. We can hit some big problem this summer, and all of a sudden there's a galvanization, either in advance of the election or in the lame duck. I always believe that we should keep the work of government going, keep the policy ideas going, continue the conversation. This is a very vibrant time, actually, if things are in a lull. This is a very vibrant time to actually have some of the conversations we're having right now to say, well, what does the menu look like, and what's in the art of the possible? Because we also know with a new administration that there's a very productive period of about 18 months when a lot of stuff moves and gets done. And if you don't have the products on the shelves, ready to look at and decide what you're going to put in the shopping cart, then you don't make progress. And so I'm actually, as a policy wonk or geek, whichever word you want to apply, this period between now and January is actually very, very important to the country, even as we pay attention to the broader election themes.
So I want to thank the sponsors of this event, the American Petroleum Institute, as well as our panelists, Joe Stanko, Senator Byron Dorgan, Jim Connaughton, and Kevin Bock. Thank you all very much, and thank you all for attending.